more about these effects in our exhibition upstairs, and I commend it to you afterwards. I had the opportunity a few months ago to visit the breathtaking Yellowstone National Park. I mean, I've actually tried to visit as many national parks as I can in the United States. They are really a fantastic treasure, and the National Park Service deserves enormous credit for the way in which they manage and preserve this valuable part of your national history. But I was in Yellowstone, and I was particularly struck by the fact that Yellowstone is a kind of giant Petri dish of evolution, because it has been preserved in almost its natural state for such a long time that scientists can actually discover through the study of nature in Yellowstone, learn so much about the origin of the planet, the origin of our species, and the impact of climate change through literally millions of years. And that was when I first had the idea of organizing an event based on the impact of climate change and specifically national parks. And I discovered that Yellowstone was impacted by global warming, and soon it will be drier than it has been in 10,000 years. And many species like grizzlies, foxes, and trout will either become extinct or will need to adapt to a very changed environment. And rising temperatures have already caused whitebark pines to die off at a rate of 85%. So Europe and the United States are unfortunately affected more and more by extreme weather conditions, and we see more climate-related disasters such as forest fires and hurricanes. But positive change is possible, and in many regions around the world, countries are taking action. Last week, the European Union adopted new legislation setting out even more ambitious climate targets. We also hosted the second Ministerial on Climate Action by the European Union, Canada, and China to maintain strong momentum for climate action ahead of COP24. And we are steadily implementing our own European action pledges. Many US cities, states, companies, and philanthropic groups have also stepped in to fill the void and to make sure that America Inc. continues to play its part to deliver on the Paris Agreement. And I'm very much encouraged by these developments. And we will hear more about these actions from our next speakers. So there is a huge amount to be discussed, much information to share, and much to learn from each other. We feel we've gathered some of the most remarkable champions of action, climate action here today, men and women who endeavor every day to preserve our natural wonders. They will tell us how we can all contribute to making our planet and our national parks great again. So now please join me in welcoming Sally Jewell, former US Secretary of the Interior, Mara Šefčovič, Vice President of the European Commission for Energy Union, and who is also a co-chair of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, who will engage in a fireside-style discussion, absent the fire, but with global warming we don't need it, because we're kept warm enough. And this will be moderated by Sherry Goodman, who's well known to you all, a senior fellow at the Wilson Center, and of course who's recognized as someone who has played an enormous role in the field of climate security over the years. And we're delighted to have all three of them participate. So it's my pleasure to give them the story and to give them the floor and ask them to tell their story. And finally, I hope that collectively we will all manage to reduce the stress we place on the environment and on our glorious national parks in particular, as this will be one very clear step to ensure their conservation. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a privilege and an honor to be here with you today. And thank you for those kind words and for what many of us call helping us keep hope alive on climate action for America Inc., as you well said, because we know we have many actors here who are working to keep this hope alive. And I'm privileged. I live here in Washington, D.C., and I have a national park right behind my house. Rock Creek Park, and so it's a great privilege and wonder for all of us to share that, and I hope many of you will get to enjoy our national parks and what they do for America and for climate action. We're very privileged to have here today two fantastic speakers who really bring both sides of climate action, energy and innovation, and our public lands, trust and stewardship together. And I'm going to give our Vice President of the EU, Mara Šefčovič, an opportunity to share his vision with you, some of the important work that's been going on in Brussels just in the last week to advance climate action and climate security. And if I could ask you, Mr. Vice President, to come up and address for us what are the important takeaways for an American audience from the important policy deal struck last week in Brussels on energy efficiency and renewables as regards the EU's level of ambition in fighting climate change, and from the high-level climate events in Brussels on climate security and innovation. If you would please join us.
Thank you very much, Sherry, Ambassador, Secretary, Joel, ladies and gentlemen. At first being here, I mean, in this particular time, the first thing I want to say that I very much like how these flags are together. And this is how it should be, also between the United States and European Union. Because we went through a lot, and I mean, yesterday and today, I mean, in all the meetings I have, and I just came from the Senate, I was just underlying the fact that for us in Europe, United States of America are the closest of allies, that we have common agenda, we have to work together, and we have to work together on many issues, not only on the trade, but especially on future of democracies, rule of law, and of course the future of our generations. And therefore I am very thankful to Mr. McAleese, who already warned me that he would be the last speaker, who would be kind of last speaker before we can get to the drinks. And therefore he gave me his book in advance. But what I like about this book is actually the conversation we had with him, because he was very clear in telling us that our best hope, I would say in all our countries, if it comes to the fight against climate change, and if it comes to very topical discussions we have when we are raising this issue, is our young people and our young generations. I have 3 children, 2 daughters, 28, 26, and the son who is taking the rest of our parental energy out of my wife and me. He is 19. But the fact is that they understand the nature much better than I do, and I'm involved in this business already for some time, because for them it's natural. For them it's part of their life. For them, thinking about what is more environmentally cautious, more environmentally friendly, comes as a first choice, the first step they would do. And I think we have a high hope with our young generation, and the only disagreement I had with Mr. McAleese is when he said the sooner we leave the stage, the better it would be, because these great young kids and young generation will take over. So I am in my 50s, so I still want to work a little bit, so I hope it will come a little later on. But you know, coming to the topical issue, I really would like to thank all of you for coming to debate this very important issue. I think it's a great venue. I saw the pictures in the gallery. They really demonstrate how the nature is changing because of the climate change, and how important it is for us to make sure that we would preserve it for the next generation. What we are doing in Brussels on this matter, I have to say that for us, Paris Agreement, and I had the honor and the privilege to be there, was something special. You had a feeling that for that brief moment when this agreement was reached, that the mankind maybe for the first time did the right thing. That we kind of felt that we as a global community of humans finally put our act together. That we realized that we are responsible for the damage to our planet, and that we are the only ones who can repair it. And it was, I would say, very, very special, and I'm glad to say that the world took it very, very seriously. Of course, as you know, in the city, particularly well, this climate skepticism is alive. There are still politicians who doesn't believe that climate change exists. But at the same time, I have to say that I never met so many motivated people working on the climate issues like I've met in the United States after this announcement was made that United States of America leaving Paris Agreement. I saw that unbelievable mobilization on the level of the governors of the states. I saw unbelievable motivation on the level of the mayors of your great cities in America. I met numerous business leaders, some of them yesterday, who are making very important choices, especially our tech industry. Okay, if I have a data center, I want to have a renewable energy. I want to have zero carbon footprint, and I want to be very diligent in my policies. And that's very, very important, and that's a message we need to hear in Europe, because if it comes to the climate diplomacy, if it comes to climate policy, we Europeans had to assume the global leadership. We are doing our best. We are working with the developing countries. We are working with our partners in the Paris Agreement, and we are also doing our utmost that we would lead by example. Sherry and Ambassador have been already referring to what I consider to be very good month for Europe and very good month for the climate change, because we managed, as a 28 European member states, agree on very important targets for 2030. I mean, by 2030, we would have 32% of our energy coming from renewables. It means that if it comes to electricity, more than 70% of electricity in our grids would be low carbon. We agreed that we would have energy efficiency in our buildings on the level of 32.5%, meaning that we would be very strong on the smart buildings, on passive buildings, and to this we also adjusted our building codes for the next decade. We approved the proposal to make sure that every third car on the European highways in 2030 would be or electric or hybrid, meaning zero or low emission cars. And I have to say that why is this possible in Europe? It is because we are very much blessed by very strong public support of our citizens for what we do. The people in Germany didn't mind to pay more for electricity when they've been starting with so-called Energiewende or introducing the renewables, sometimes for very high price. Our mayors are extremely active to push for having cleaner transport solution for their cities, and our industries realize that to go for these environmentally friendly solutions is not only good for the environment, but there is already a strong business case. We created millions of jobs in the clean tech and in the green tech, and I believe that all this is only starting. Result of that effort is that since 1990 we managed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by 24%, but at the same time we managed to grow by almost 60% our GDP. So we have proven that you can actually grow and you can cut your emissions. And this is, I think, very important examples for many countries in the world where they are struggling with the choices, when they are struggling with the solutions they have to look for to put the countries on the safe path for the future. So to conclude, I really would like to thank you very much for your participation in today's event, for your support for the positive policies, and for being good friend of your planet and being good friend of the European Union. We are very much looking forward to our discussions, to the future cooperation, and I particularly will be delighted to listen to the Secretary Jewel, because I think she had one of the most fascinating jobs, to be responsible for national parks, and you have so many of them in the United States. I visited quite a few of them. Must be very exciting, very responsible, and you could see how successful you are when you visit your parks and you see that they are beautiful, they are well maintained, and they are preserved for the future generations. This is what we have to do for all our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. You sit there. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. That was a delightful way to open it. And thank you for sharing with us that you have 3 almost grown children, which I do as well. And they also are leading the way into the future, even if they need a rap on the knuckles every once in a while. But I see many good young people here in the audience, some of whom I know well, and I know that you all are the light of the future. You're the ones that are taking us into the innovation that we need to bring us the clean economy and a sustainable future. Now it's my great privilege to introduce and welcome Secretary Jewell. She's, I'm sure, well known to you. She's been a jewel in the crown of American conservation and stewardship for decades, from her leadership across many industries, from leading the REI, a great outdoor adventure company, to also her stewardship at the Department of Interior, which is, as the Vice President noted, one of sort of the crown jewels of American stewardship and conservation, our public lands which stretch across our national parks, our wildlife refuges, and many other lands that are important for conservation. And she has been a leader in that field and bringing climate action onto America's public lands. So with that, Secretary Jewell, I'd like to welcome you to the podium to share your remarks on America's stewardship.
Thanks, Sherry. And thank you, Vice President Šešović. Is that close enough? And you are from Slovenia, correct?
Slovakia.
Oh, Slovakia. Darn. Well, I've hiked in Slovenia in the Julian Alps. I know, very close. Well, I enjoyed your outdoors, including even the rain, which happened at the time I was hiking, but it's a beautiful, beautiful part of Europe. So it's a delight to be here. Thank you, Sherry, for the introduction. Maybe in the audience, I haven't seen him yet. He might be out there, is my former Deputy Secretary, Mike Connor, in the back. So questions about water, public lands, climate, he's the one, he's the brains of the operation. Anyway, Mike is now a lawyer with Wilmer Hale. Looking forward to someday moving back to the Rocky Mountains. Thanks for being here, Mike. So I want to first thank the EU for pulling this together, and those who organize it, including my old friends from the National Parks Conservation Association, who I think played a role. And one of the things that Sherry and I talked about was a question she wanted me to address, which is, what's sort of the importance of climate change in the management of public lands? How can we make them more resilient? How can public lands be a source of strength and innovation for us? So that's kind of where I'm going to shape my remarks. I'll also say, Mr. Vice President, I was in Paris. It was for the climate discussions. It was a highlight of my life in many ways. And the thing that was the most striking to me about being there was not just the energy, but it was frankly the incredible influence of the very small island nations and people from those island nations who stepped up and said, didn't wag their finger at us as some of the largest polluters in the history of the planet, but instead said, here's what we're doing. We encourage you to set the bar higher. Set a standard of no more than 1.5 degrees C increase, because your decisions will impact whether or not we have a home. And that was a really striking part of the Paris Agreement that helped me understand how important it is when we bring in our personal stories and our personal experiences and put these discussions not in the way of science in the abstract, but science, not science, but climate change in what it means to us as human beings. And I will say, with all this talk in our country about immigration, we've seen nothing compared to what we will see around the world as climate change takes hold and people leave their places that they can no longer live and migrate around the world. That's got national security implications. It's got humanitarian considerations, and it's something that nobody's talking enough about. So let me give you a few facts on America's public lands. Roughly 30% of the landmass of the United States is in public hands, owned by all American people. About 10% is in the U.S. Forest Service, and that's managed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. 20% is in the U.S. Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management are the big players. Interior also oversees U.S. federal waters out to our economic zone. So that's about 1.7 billion acres of water. What you probably don't know is if you take all of the carbon-based energy, largely coal, oil, and gas, produced on U.S. federal public lands, and you burn it in its generation of energy or transportation or otherwise, the emissions from those sources of carbon on America's public lands would be the 5th largest carbon emitter in the world, behind only the United States as a whole, China as a whole, India, and Russia. Then it's U.S. public lands. So we think about national parks, which are not a big source of carbon, but our Bureau of Land Management, its management of the Forest Service, mineral estate, the amount of energy produced on U.S. Public lands is enormous. And so their U.S. public land policy has a big impact on our ability to address the issue of climate change. It also has great opportunities to mitigate the impact of climate change through ecosystem services in our forests, through carbon sequestration, in potentially storing it, subsurface, and the USGS did a lot of work on that. Let me talk for a minute about how climate change is impacting our public lands today. There's a tremendous vulnerability. You see in the news pretty much every night wildfires that are longer and hotter. They're burning in places they've never burned before. They're earlier than they've been before. They're all the way from Florida to Alaska. They are devastating communities. They're devastating individuals. They are facilitating a negative spiral with invasive species, with landslides, when you've got big weather events that wash away that now vulnerable soil, with forests that don't regenerate because the fires burn so hot that they've sterilized basically the soil. That has an impact on our water infrastructure and so on. So it's very, very significant. So that's wildfires. Drought, something that my colleague Mike Connor worked very hard on. The Colorado River, we have a paleo record looking at tree rings from trees that are 1,200 years old. And we are in the driest period in at least those last 1,200 years, and that's all we can measure so far. In California in 2015, they were in a profound, extraordinary drought where there was no snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And the Sierra Nevada are a critical reservoir, frozen reservoir of water supply for the state of California, our agricultural communities and so on. As a result, groundwater depletion, subsidence and so on is impacting those communities very significantly. And of course we've had severe storms. Frequent severe storms, 2,000-year events just north of here in Maryland. Superstorm Sandy whacked the east coast of the United States in 2012. I started in my job in 2013. We had a mess on our hands. Statue of Liberty was severely impacted. It had just opened, the crown had just opened, it got shut back down and was closed again for quite some time. Ellis Island, where we welcomed immigrants to this country, perhaps the ancestors of many people in this room, was filled with water. We also saw, though, the extraordinary benefit of green infrastructure as those storms slammed the East Coast. If you were fortunate to be inland of Fire Island National Seashore or the Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, those dunes and wetlands and natural green infrastructure protected your communities. Jamaica Bay in New York protected parts of New York City where others that got the full fury of the storm were flooded and were burning and so on. So the Department of the Interior got $800 million of the $60 billion that the federal government spent to address Superstorm Sandy. We used that to repair these places that I referenced, but we also took $100 million of it and in a very innovative way said, we want cities to work together and to basically engage in a competitive grant process where we will fund your willingness to invest in green infrastructure. And I don't have time to go into examples in this upfront piece, but it was extraordinary how they came together, how they rebuilt beaches, how they put in dunes, how they reintroduced wetlands, and how they began to change their zoning, and this was all done on a very local basis. So we're going to hear soon from Gary Mackless about the impact of climate change on national parks, and you'll see some pictures back there, particularly Glacier National Park, a historic lodge that had stood for many decades, if not over 100 years, in Glacier National Park. Would burn down in wildfires. Glacier is named for the glaciers. They probably won't be any by 2030, if not sooner. Joshua trees are leaving Joshua Tree National Park, moving upslope. And of course, if you want to recreate in national parks, you might be dealing with fires, with smoke, with drought, and that's having an impact on the economies of local communities. But we have tremendous opportunities on our public lands as well. We mapped out the California desert, 10 million acres of federal public land alone, to say, where should we drive solar and wind energy development? Where are the logical corridors? Where are the areas that are critical to conservation? How do we plan this from a landscape level view? We did it in Utah with master leasing plans for the BLM. We deconflicted so that we could accelerate permitting for companies that wanted to do business there. So it was good for business, it was good for the environment, it addressed environmental concerns, and it really drove development where the impact of that infrastructure, transmission lines and roads, would be less significant. We permitted 52 different utility scale solar and wind energy facilities on public lands, up from 0 at the beginning of the Obama administration. And we began a process of offshore leasing for wind in the Atlantic, learning from the Europeans and what they have done with wind energy that is tremendous potential. So from a security standpoint, and Sherry knows more about this than I do, when you have locally sourced, distributed energy, that is a lot less vulnerable to disruption. It is domestically produced power, and we've got great potential to do that. I mentioned carbon sequestration in our forests, our wetlands, our peat bogs. The ecosystem services we have from our natural landscapes are something that in our laws we do not value. We only value the extractive properties, but we know that the value is there. And just recently there was an economic impact study done in my home state of Washington, the other Washington, on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, putting a value on that of $1 trillion US. And that's in avoided sewage treatment plants, it's in clean air, it's in clean water, it's in a natural infrastructure. And the more we begin to share that, the more we will value these places for their true worth to our planet. So there's a lot of challenges I have in this document, 11 pages, single-spaced, of a rollback of the Trump administration of just about every single thing that we did within the Obama administration around energy and climate change and moving from a fossil fuel-based economy. Subsidies are back for oil, gas, and coal. The streamlining and permitting of federal public lands for renewables has been undermined. The planning that we have done, the plug has been pulled on. Climate change has been pulled from documents like the one that Dr. Mackless worked on for the national parks. And as I went through this document, there really wasn't one thing that I think we would be proud of that we worked on that isn't under attack. The good news is that many of these things are being done in a slipshod way. They're not going through the process they need to. They are being challenged by wonderful organizations, and in the United States, we have checks and balances on power, and thank God we do, because the work that is being done to offset what this administration is doing to undermine everything this country has been doing to address climate change is extraordinary work, and it's very necessary work. So if I want to leave you on a reassuring note, it is that, as the Vice President mentioned, businesses are stepping up, municipalities are stepping up, states are stepping up, the Global Covenant of Mayors led by Michael Bloomberg, Jerry Brown in California is hosting a major climate summit from people around the world in San Francisco this fall. People are stepping up to the table. Businesses will ignore this at their peril, so in spite of what happens, just down the street, we will be addressing our obligations to the Paris Climate Accord, regardless of what this administration does. You can clap for that. So I just want to leave you. I want to leave you with my favorite quote, and my children are well beyond your children up here. I have grandchildren at this point, and my favorite proverb that guided my actions at the Department of the Interior is, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So it's up to all of us, emerging leaders, old farts like me, to work together to deliver a future that we are proud to leave to succeeding generations. Thanks.
Well, Secretary Jewell, I think you inspire all of us to keep that hope alive and keep pushing forward on climate action. So, Mr. Vice President, let me ask you now, recognizing, as the Secretary has so eloquently just said, that U.S. climate leadership has shifted from the federal government to state and local governments, to mayors, to the private and nonprofit sector, to businesses and many others. How can Americans best engage with you and with our EU partners on climate diplomacy?
I think that both of us already referred to that positive mobilization, and I would say to the positive energy which is emanating from your business leaders, from the mayors, and from your governors. We're working together, as Secretary Jewell reminded us, together with Mike Bloomberg on the Global Covenant of Mayors, and I think that the fact how the mayors are creative, how they're ready to exchange the best practices, and how we are looking for the ways how we would help the mayors to channel the financing, the investment in their way, so they can do more for energy efficiency. They can install more advanced technologies if it comes to the water treatment, waste treatment, or if they can develop more and better organized public transport. All this, I think, is something which is most practical and where we can actually help the most fighting the climate change, because I mean the cities are the problems, but they are also the solutions. So if we can help them to be more environmentally friendly, we are really helping the whole planet. So there the communication, mayors to mayors, Americans, Europeans, rest of the world, I think it's working very well. I would say then another area which is also very important is to promote those forward-looking businesses and business leaders who are so conscious, and they clearly demonstrate to all of us that they are making this choice, of course, with a, I would say, good purpose in mind, but at the same time they already developed this concept from being purely environmental issue into the very solid business case. Because then, of course, the private initiative push it further. It kind of creates this snowball effect, and you see the more and more businesses realizing that it's, it's good for the business, it's good for the community. Let's use these technologies more often. And of course, when we discussed with the American administration what to do next with the Paris Agreement, and at that time it was, as you can imagine, a very difficult conversation, and I appreciate the way how the effort was made, that we will work with you in many aspects. We want to be very strong in innovation. We want to be engaged also with the developing countries. I said, that's all good, but if you are not at the table, you are not at the table, and we are missing you. We would need, very often in these difficult conversations, because I mean the fight against climate change, it's not easy. I mean, we need sometimes diplomatic muscle. We need to deliver somehow this $100 billion we promised to the developing world as of 2020. Not only public budget, but the private investment as well. And that would be, I think, one of the big areas if we cannot somehow rely on let's say, official or public policies. So let's try to mobilize for what the American is so famous for, this entrepreneurial spirit, that business creativity, your strong financial institutions, and let's help these efforts through these green bonds, through the green banking, through the, I would say, projects in that sphere, which would really drive also private initiative into our common efforts, and I think that would be the major contribution which would be welcome for all. So we are very happy about that intensity of the contacts we have on all these levels. We of course miss the fact that we cannot talk about the climate change anymore with the official US representations, but of course we hope that this will change, because we know that the climate change is happening, and I think that you do not have that many beautiful countries like United States of America where you really feel it. I mean, there is a hurricane season in Florida. You had all these dramatic storms in New York. We are all watching, glued to the TV screens when we saw your glacial vortexes in the States. So I think here the people know that climate change is happening, that the weather was not like this just 10 years ago, and therefore I believe that this would also create that public pressure for being open, discussing it, and being much more pushy in resolving it.
Thank you. So, Secretary Jewell, let's talk about the weather. I mean, we all know that we are experiencing increasingly disruptive events and extreme weather events, from hurricanes, the hurricane train that came through the Gulf Coast, Florida and Puerto Rico this year, Superstorm Sandy you mentioned, many others, sea level rise, increasing wildfires, flash floods that are now on a much more regular basis, the intensity of the rainfall with warmer ocean and air temperatures has increased dramatically. Now, you've worked to identify those challenges on our public lands. Also, as Secretary of Interior, you supported science and sharing data to better understand our Earth systems, particularly in the climate era as we're experiencing these extreme weather events. How can advances in this Earth system predictive capability better enable us to cope with these increasing extreme weather and disruptive events? And how can that also be a part of innovation and technology leadership?
All great questions. And the short answer is government is essential in helping shine a spotlight on what's happening scientifically to our climate. I just last week was visiting a major NOAA facility that happens to be in Seattle and chatting with employees there. And the weather data they have, the ocean buoy data, and the predictive capability that you can combine with the knowledge banks that we have within universities across this country produces extraordinary capability in terms of predicting weather trends and weather patterns, which has been very, very helpful to all of us in our ability to respond. Without that basic science, without the satellites, without the ocean buoys, without the tools that our scientists have, we would be in much worse shape than we are today. But I'll also give you an example of American innovation and where business working in conjunction with government can make it even better. So I did a fellowship at Harvard in the fall, and each week I did a section on different parts of our democracy necessary to steward a future that's both economically successful and environmentally sustainable. One of those sessions was on government furthers knowledge, business makes it useful, is what I called it. It's kind of clickbait to get kids to come to your sessions. But at any rate, I had Mary Glacken there. Mary was the deputy director or deputy administrator for NOAA. She's now at IBM working in their weather company. So when government can provide information like Hurricane Harvey is going to hit Houston, Texas, a lot of people are going to need to evacuate, what they can do with that data and with the computing power, in this case of IBM, but it could be others, is say, this area, this neighborhood is highly vulnerable. People need to leave. this neighborhood is likely okay. And so it gets much more granular, and it can be delivered to your cell phone and so on. The USGS, working on earthquake early warning with different type, not climate change, but another natural disaster, working with business and civil society, and in this case, the city of Los Angeles, on taking that data that they know and turning it into useful information that people can react to. The other thing, though, I think is also shining a spotlight on the ecosystem services, the actual value of public lands in mitigating the risks of climate change. As we look at fire risk, we know that with limited dollars to reduce the risk of fire, we can do that in areas that are highly vulnerable in terms of impacting water supply. So there was a lot of science in every aspect of the things that we did that made us not only look at how do we reduce our carbon footprint through, you know, renewable energy generation and so on public lands, but also how do we adapt to address the very real issue of climate change, which I know Dr. Macklis is going to get into, like sea level rise, which is happening, and we have to proactively remove artifacts that are in the way, say at historic Jamestown. How do we address perhaps encouraging more mangrove swamps and so on in the Florida Everglades? How do we work with scientists and the Army Corps of Engineers and sugar growers and so on to restore the Florida Everglades before Florida actually loses its water supply, South Florida, which would most likely happen before, you know, they get washed away with sea level rise. So all of these things, public lands can play a role in you know, addressing, in being part of the solution, but also in understanding what's happening.
Right, thank you. And I think, you know, we're just on the cusp today in terms of our predictive capability and being able to close some of the gap between short-term weather prediction and longer-term global climate models with seasonal and sub-seasonal forecasting, which will enable us more proactively to make all sectors of society, from energy, transportation, public lands management, more resilient as we can better manage to future events. Now, Mr. Vice President, I know you're in Washington this week in part, you know, for the World Gas Conference. And its growth in the natural gas sector, you know, that has enabled the U.S. in the last decade to become a gas global energy power. You know, the U.S. and others and EU now have the ability to become clean energy powers as well. I know you've talked about the ambitious goals that the EU has set. How can American companies work to help meet those goals and continue down the path of clean energy leadership?
I think that, of course, in several ways. I mean, you started your question about the gas, and I think that when we've been looking about how to achieve our goals for 2030 and how we would continue with our decarbonization efforts to make sure that in the second half of this century would be in the carbon neutral society, which is, by the way, the commitment we all signed up to in Paris. You need, of course, to do a lot of changes. And when we look at the gas, of course, what is the positive feature of the gas is the fact that it's 50% less carbon intensive than coal. And I think that the United States achieved a great deal of reducing the greenhouse gas emission by switching from coal to gas. And something similar is happening also now in Europe, where you would see that more and more countries gradually phasing out the coal and is using more renewables and gas as I would say, backup source for powering our energy systems. We also are working, as I was referring to in my introductory remarks, on cleaner mobility. And we know that it will take a while until we develop the technology for, let's say, heavy-duty vehicles, the big trucks or big ships to be powered by electricity. So we would again need this step in between. And again, I think that the most promising has all been again relying on the gas, which could power these big machines on on the long distances. But there is a lot other technologies, and here the computing power of US tech giants comes very handy, and it's very important because it helps us in a better modeling, but it also helps us in setting the examples what we want to become norm as of the next decade. We just adopted the new rules for architects, for the building construction, where we want to have smart buildings being built as of the beginning of the next decade, where we would make sure that the energy consumption is minimal. And I already saw the buildings which are actually generating the energy and not consuming it. So today, technologically, it's possible. We just have to make it cheaper. We just have to make it a wider scale. And the impact of that would be enormous, because I don't know the figure for the United States of America, but in Europe, we consume almost 40% of our energies for heating and cooling of our buildings. For sure, we can do better. The technology exists, but you have to find the money for the renovations. You have to write the proper building codes, and you have to motivate the tenants or the companies using these buildings as office space to go for this reconstruction. So I'm absolutely sure that that political will combined with the technological advancement is the best response to the challenges we lie ahead. And I would say the good news is that for many of these challenges we already have the technological answers. What we need is political will, we need the public mobilization, and we need to channel investment for this proper goals to make sure that these new technologies can really take off the ground and we can use them in this fight against climate change.
Sherry, can I add one thing
Please.
on that? One of the biggest challenges we have in the United States is the venting, inadvertent and intentional, of methane into our atmosphere, which is an incredibly harmful greenhouse gas. So one of the rules that we put forward in the Obama administration dealt with venting and flaring of natural gas on public lands. That's one of the rules that's being rolled back by this administration. It did survive the Congressional Review Act, barely, by one vote. But it makes no sense to be working on it as a bridge fuel if the amount that you're venting actually offsets the gains from the carbon. That's the easier challenge to solve. The harder challenge to solve are the leaky pipes that exist around many of our cities in our infrastructure, and the fugitive methane from pipelines. So I don't know if that's part of the discussions in the Gas Congress or conference that is going on this week, but it's a big issue, and it's oftentimes not accounted for when people look at the positive benefits of natural gas.
Not only that, the captured methane can then help repower other sources.
And the American people aren't getting a royalty, as they should be, on these resources that belong to them that are just going up into the atmosphere.
Right. So speaking of energy on public lands, Secretary Jewell, you supported development of commercial scale renewable energy on public lands and waters. I remember well from my time in the Department of Defense. Well, my time was in the 1990s when the Department of Interior was taking a lot of closing bases in that era and converting them to public land use. And we work cooperatively also because our military on many public lands across the United States. So those training ranges are vitally important to our national security. Renewables and other energy sources on military lands, both for the purpose of advancing overall national energy objectives, but also in a quest to improve our energy security and our energy resilience for the military. And I know you were deeply involved with those efforts. I wonder if you'd share with us some how that also helps our national security posture.
Yeah, there's no question, and I would credit my predecessor, Ken Salazar, for really moving this forward with Secretary of the Navy in particular, but other branches of the military. military is very concerned about its dependence on foreign sources of energy. And it's certainly a big issue in Europe, I'm sure, especially where a lot of your gas comes from and some of the challenges there. Same thing here. When it is renewable energy, it is produced close by, on site. It's actually, they were looking at it in the military as a less expensive alternative to some of the fuel sources that they had. You know, we have a strategic petroleum reserve. We could tap that if we needed to. That would run out very, very quickly if we had some sort of a military engagement. So really, it was a national security was driving it, but also cost. And tremendous amount of innovation done by virtue of the investments made by our US military in renewable energy. So we are now in a position where if we just remove the subsidies for fossil fuels without doing anything else for renewable energy, in part because of these investments early on by our military and so on, have a less expensive and more carbon reduced carbon energy future than the track we're on right now because of the subsidies we continue to have. So military was significant.
Well, thank you. I know that we are almost out of time, but I'd like to ask you, Mr. Vice President, in closing, I know some of the important announcements last week were also on EU leadership on climate and security. And over 10 years ago now, I worked with American military leaders to characterize climate change as a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world. And we see that's true now even in stable regions, and many areas are being destabilized by climate change, from the small island developing states that you eloquently mentioned to parts of the Middle East and Africa, from droughts and floods and disruptive events. This has become, and I think Europe is now experiencing this firsthand with a greater wave of migration now than has been experienced since World War II. Can you share with us some of what Federico Mogherini and other leaders laid out last week, and the efforts that you'll probably, I would expect, share in California as well in the summit coming up this fall, the climate summit?
You're absolutely right, and I agree with Secretary Jewell that when we talk about the climate change, of course the environmental reasoning and environmental discussion is what is the most natural one. It's usually number one topic which comes to your head when we are talking about climate change. But migratory pressures, the poverty which climate change brings, the tension in between the nations or different ethnic groups or tribes in Africa. Huge potential for the future conflict, and I remember, and I was reading with a great interest, I think it was analysis of U.S. armed forces about climate change and impact on the stability and the potential conflicts around the world. So this is, I think, something which is a huge challenge. And this challenge is multiplied by the fact that we still have on our planet 1.3 billion people who do not have basic access to electricity. And of course, we cannot deny them the right for the development, for starting the business, for the kids, you know, to have the computers, to have the light, to create, I would say, normal, civilized living conditions. So how to overcome this challenge? I mean, most of these people without basic access to electricity lives in Africa. We have still 300 million, if I remember correctly, people in India with the same challenge. And we know that if they would go, let's say, in our path, if they would follow our, I would say, carbon footprint, it would be devastating for our planet and it would be devastating for the regions. So we simply have to find another way. And another way, again, is possible, and it would very much rely on how can we use the technologies of today. I mean, in Africa, when I'm talking to the African leaders, I'm always telling them, you know, for you to build some kind of huge power plant and then to take all the cables all across the deserts or the jungle, I mean, it's impossible. I mean, there are not enough money for that. I mean, and it's not needed anymore. We have now, I would say, the microgrid solutions. We have solar panels. We have little wind turbines which can easily power the whole community, small towns and villages in Africa, and that's exactly what is needed. And on top of it is more secure. It's easy to repair. It creates local jobs because I mean you need these electricians who would install the solar panels, all these microgrid solutions. So the question is the money, and we decided to learn a little bit from what we tested in Europe in the last 3 years. We call it European Fund for Strategic Investments, where we are actually leveraging our initial investment in a way that when we go for a riskier project, we say, look, it's very interesting. We understand that you as a private investor, as a private equity, you might have a certain concern, but let's go into this project together and we can guarantee you that if there would be eventual first loss, it's upon us. We are going to pay for it. So you shouldn't worry. You have that security of the investment. You shouldn't worry about the return or about the loss of your investment. And we actually generated in this way with I think, leverage ratio, I think 1 to 15, more than 300 billion euros for infrastructural projects across Europe, most of them in renewables, in interconnectors, in digital infrastructure. So now we want to do the same for Africa. So we just approved the plan which is called External Investment Fund for Africa, where we want to use the same approach, but not only the EIB, but also World Bank and other development financial institutions are invited to join, and we hope that in this way we can generate more than 40 billion of euros for the project like this on African continent, because we believe that with that kind of money we can really cover most of the African needs if it comes to microgrids, renewables, or giving the power to these communities which are currently really literally living in the dark, and help them to jump over that fossil journey all of us had to undertake because we didn't have that technology at that time available. And I think that this is something what we can do together, and we hope that also we can tap into that potential of American financial institutions, because I know how the shareholders are pushing the investors, the financial institutions, for this climate mainstreaming, meaning to spend 20, 25, 30, in the case of EIB, it's European Investment Bank, it's even a higher share of the investment portfolio into this green tech, clean tech, renewable energy. So I think that this would be one of the ways how we can leverage the investment and bring the money to support these projects, and I think that would be the best of service we can provide to the developing countries and help the climate change at the same time.
Well, I'd ask you all now to join me in thanking the Vice President and Secretary Jewel for an excellent conversation this afternoon.
All right, good evening. We're going to transition into our second panel now. My name is Mark Wenzler. I'm with the National Parks Conservation Association. We are America's oldest and only NGO that focuses on protecting national parks. We've been around almost as long as the National Park Service, founded in 1919, just 3 years after the National Park Service was founded, with offices all around the country working deeply on our national parks to protect them. And as you imagine, that's a bigger job today than it was just a few years ago. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our next two panelists who really have been very deeply involved in managing, thinking about, and writing about national parks around the world. They've been in some of the most interesting places. I look at both of their careers and think that's what I want to be when I grow up, and I think you may feel the same after hearing from them as well. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Gilles Kleitz. Dr. Kleitz is the director of the Amazonian Park of Guyana. That's an 8.4 million acre national park covering southern French Guyana, making it one of the largest national parks in the world. Since 2016, he has also served as board president of the French National Park System, and in 2017 joined the board of directors of the Amazon Conservation Team in Europe. Dr. Kleitz has long experience working in Africa and other places around the world, and also leading the French Development Agency as a senior biodiversity program manager. We are then going to hear from Dr. Gary Mackless, someone I had the pleasure of working with in his previous career at the U.S. National Park Service. Dr. Mackless is currently a university professor of environmental sustainability at Clemson University, and he did, as I mentioned, serve as the science advisor to the director of the U.S. National Park Service during the Obama administration. And in fact, he was the first scientist appointed to this position within the NPS. Dr. Mackless also served as co-leader of the U.S. Department of Interior Strategic Sciences Group, which conducts scientific assessments during major environmental crises, which I know we are, as we spoke about earlier, having many more of these days. He joined the Clemson faculty in 2013, and before that was at the University of Idaho. I think that you may have seen also, many of you got a copy of Dr. Mackless's latest book. He's written many books in his career, including The State of the World's Parks, the first systemic study of threats to protected areas around the world. A book which many of you have, co-authored with the former director of the U.S. National Park Service, John Jarvis, is The Future of Conservation in America, A Chart for Rough Water. I know Dr. Mackless will speak a bit about that book. He'll also be available after the program this evening in the gallery to sign copies of the book. He'd be happy to do that. So without further ado, Dr. Kleitz, I'd like to invite you to the podium.
Secretary Jewel, Ambassador, Vice President, good evening everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today to share with you my experience on the impacts of climate change on our national parks. I will concentrate during my presentation on very practical impacts of climate change on our national parks in France. But before doing that, I want to throw in an idea. We've been talking about green infrastructure. Secretary States in France, in African countries, in Asia, around the world are usually really a small part of our land masses or oceans. Even if you join with public lands, it's, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40% maximum. Scientists consider that to protect us with appropriate green infrastructures against the effects of climate change, we need, you know, something like 30, 40, 50% of our land covered with green infrastructure. So it means that our work as national park, as public administrator of these lands, have to extend beyond, have to extend on private lands as well. And green infrastructure and ecological performance has to come not just from public lands, but as well from privately managed land, agricultural land, forest land, and so on. It's a key issue in Europe, where we have very, very little public land, less than you do actually in the United States. National parks in France are on private land. And despite that, we achieve quite interesting conservation outputs. So let me go back anyway, after throwing in this idea for our later discussion, perhaps. Some key aspects of climate change on French national parks as an illustration of the very rapid and dramatic transformations that are taking place in some of our most emblematic and beautiful ecosystems and natural places in France. One of the most visible impacts of climate change is that on glaciers, because in France, our national parks stand on the southernmost and westernmost limit of glaciers. We are at a climatic limit, and it means that within very short time you can observe quite dramatic changes, just like in the United States. What you see on the cover slide here is the glacier of a famous mountain, a 14,000 feet high summit in the French Alps, the Barre des Écrins, near Grenoble, where I was born in the early 60s. 1 million visitors come to see this glacier. It's bottom end, actually, every year. And together with 25 other glaciers in this national park, the Glacier Blanc is very closely monitored since the 70s. Here you can see the front of the glacier with 10 years only difference, and an incredible retreat, basically, that everybody has witnessed. Measurements from satellite images, drilling, show us that in just 12 years, between 2002 and 2014, this famous glacier has lost almost 10% of its area. Its front has retracted nearly 700 meters in no more than 30 years. The mass balance of the ice of the Glacier Blanc is more negative every year. Given the summer heat, there is simply not enough snow accumulation in winter anymore to offset the melting in the summer. Altogether, in just over 15 years, on this climatic limit of the southern Western Alps, our glaciers have lost 25% of their surface and 32% of their mass. And it is estimated that by 2050, only 30% of the glaciers in the National Park des Écrins, this park, will still exist. So, near the Glacier Blanc, you've seen a glacier that is shrinking, but there are many places that where the glaciers are actually completely disappearing. So there are places that I still remember as a kid where I learned to ice climb with my father and mother, where I took friends and so on, that have just now disappeared. They're just now a scree, a bed of rocks with a lake, and nothing is left. I can't start telling here the feeling of loss when a place of seminal importance in your life is destroyed or radically transformed like this. Let me just say that when national parks are no more refuges, when these places that are supposed not to change start changing radically, sadness obviously fills your heart. You try to run around to understand exactly what happens. Perhaps you become a park warden or park ranger to try to address these issues. And you realize that your loss is matched by even bigger ecological, conservation, agricultural, and economic disruptions. And there are other impacts of climate change on mountain parks. Decline of cold-adapted species such as the mountain air, Lepus timidus, or the Sambro pine, a very emblematic tree in the Alps. Biological cycles are disrupted, other species and vegetation type are weakened, and the agricultural, pastoral, ski economy as well are impacted and have to adapt quickly. Moving now to another group of national parks, the marine national parks. The key issues that we've seen in the last 20 years are a more acidic water, which weakens the coral reefs, seashells, crustaceans, while higher temperature increase coral bleaching, with, for example, 60% of our corals in Guadeloupe that are now impacted by coral bleaching. We have a number of invertebrates such as gorgonas or other colonial madrepores that are as well seriously impacted. You have in the Mediterranean Sea some heat-loving species such as the barracuda that are invading the sea and completely transforming food chains. And you have invasive species like the colerpa here from southern seas as well that are completely choking ecosystems. In our two Mediterranean parks, Porquerolles and Calanque, we've had very serious coastal erosion, beach reduction, and fires in our iconic Mediterranean pine forests. With more than 5 million visitors in these two parks, this is obviously very hard to manage, and the impact on the economy as well is quite bad. On the tropical islands of France, where we have two national parks in Guadeloupe and in La Réunion, the frequency of mentioned in by the previous speakers is measured as more intense, more frequent, and the storms as well and the hurricanes are longer. It rains very heavily for longer times, which with serious impacts on our ecosystem and our parks. For example, last year, where both the coast of Florida and many Caribbean islands were hit, we had a really, really bad impact on the Guadeloupe National Park, where we had all the stand tropical forest, very rare in the Caribbean, was actually very sadly quite impacted by this storm. And this leads to very serious long-term vegetation changes, loss of species, and more alien invasions, basically, in species and serious loss of biodiversity. Finally, in Tampa, forests, you have as well damp and cold-loving species that have shown to weaken and deperish, sort of the European beech and a lady slipper, for example, a small, beautiful orchid. So many radical changes, many key irreversible changes that we are seeing happening and in our national parks. And to understand these, national parks in France have set several monitoring protocols and promote as well eco-responsibility and adaptive management around their limits, together with municipalities, together with private actors, together with cities, especially when it comes to land use planning and setting up green infrastructures that are conducive to conservation in the core of the national park. So we try to adapt, but we know that some of these changes are irreversible, at least at a human scale. However, our national parks in France, together with other protected areas around the planet and in the United States, constitute a unique observatory for the impacts of climate change on ecosystems in many natural regions, and especially in some of the most crucial biodiversity hotspots on our planet. So, as you see, impacts of climate change on our national parks in France are major, as in most protected areas around the world, with both ecological, conservation, and economic consequences. We monitor these changes to understand them and to promote responsible and adaptive strategies, though irreversibility and lack of easy solution is often the rule. I will close this quick presentation to show you just a few images of parks in France to know where climate change is happening, here in the Northern Alps, here in the Pyrenees, here in Porquerolles on the Mediterranean coast, here in the Massif Central, medium altitude forest, where there is as well a serious impact on our broadleaf forests, here in the Écrins National Park, Southern Alps, and its neighbor, the Parc National du Mercantour at the very tip of the Southern Alps, the Guadeloupe National Park in the Caribbean with unique species that are highly threatened with climate change, La Réunion National Park, a beautiful volcanic island, and then the French Guyana National Park, which is, you know, bigger than I calculated, Delany, Yosemite, and Sequoia National Park put together. So it's a huge land area with as well impacts of climate change, especially on the submountainous forests. So to close that, I would dearly encourage you to visit these parks. This would be, I think, a small contribution to help them face a future of climate change and try to find solutions for adaptation, which we will now explore with Gary. Thank you very much for your attention.
We have some interesting conversation to have, but I would like to invite Dr. Macklis to the podium first to give his presentation. I think we can then have a very good and in-depth conversation about park management.
Thank you all for coming. It's a special honor to be reunited with Secretary Jewell, an extraordinary and wise leader that I was able to work for and with during last years of the Obama administration, a time that feels so long, long ago. For reasons that will become obvious, my remarks here do not represent the official views of Clemson University. The impacts of climate change that Gilles spoke of extend to national parks in the United States. NPS climate scientist Patrick Gonzalez notes field measurements have demonstrated that glaciers are melting in glacier, the sea level is rising at golden Yellowstone wildfires are changing their timing and extent, and coral is bleaching in the Virgin Islands. Published analyses of these and similar cases around the world suggest the cause is human-caused climate change. If we do not reduce greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, cars, as well as deforestation, continued climate change may fundamentally alter many of the globally unique ecosystems, endangered plants, wildlife, animal species, and physical and cultural resources that represent national parks around the world. And the impacts are also local, noticeable, and nuanced. At the Jefferson Memorial here in Washington, D.C., 3.3 miles from this gallery, sea level has, as measured by tidal gauges, has risen 37 centimeters in 50 years. 37 centimeters in 50 years. Washington, D.C.'s cherry trees have advanced peak bloom a full week between 1970 and 1999. And the phenology, the timing cycles of many other national parks have begun to alter as well, have begun to alter in ways both subtle and significant. Melting snowpacks leading to wildfires, advanced flowering before the pollinators arrive, leading to declines in plant reproduction, animal migrations shifting, and so forth. What is clear and unavoidable is that climate change will be the defining challenge to national parks for an entire generation. I would ask everyone here under 30 who cares about national parks to just stand for a moment. Under 30 and you care about it. And by confronting climate change and national parks. By climate change, agricultural systems, urban megacities, island nations, national security concerns, governance, economic institutions, and citizens from Alberta to Albania, Austria to Angola will confront the consequences of our fossil fuel-driven age. What then can we do? In 2012, the National Park Service commissioned A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. And I promise you, this is one of the few conservation books that quotes Richard Nixon, Bob Dylan, and James Baldwin all in the same chapter. And lastly, optimism. Why are we optimistic? We have faith in and admiration for what the next generation of conservationists can and will accomplish. They inherit a world fraught with peril and a nation divided. But their inheritance also includes access to global knowledge, commitment to improving their communities, awareness that they can and should empower themselves over our careers. We have met countless young persons interested in parks, history, education, politics, science, environmental justice, public service, or all of the above. Their enthusiasm for making a difference and impatience over waiting their turn is enlivening. They will assuredly make their own mistakes, as have we, and we'll learn from them. If, as mentioned earlier, the future of conservation in America will depend on these exceptional young persons, our optimism for conservation is well-founded. A brief conclusion, because I'm the only one standing between our discussion and the reception, as the Vice President warned me. We are here in this beautiful gallery with these artistic imaginations. Let no one here be fooled into thinking the climate conversation is simply one of science and politics. The Russians are right when they say art is bread. Art is a compelling voice to the present and future generations grappling with climate change. I want to close then with a comment about a novelist. William T. Vollmann, author of 10 novels in the United States, including a book that won our prestigious National Book Award, a novel entitled Europe Central, has recently written a nonfiction book, a large-scale work on climate change. It's written to the future, all 2,000 pages of it, entitled Carbon Ideologies. He reminds us that the lights of this gallery and the chilling of our refreshments come at a cost to the future. He writes, to the future, what might we remind you of? When I was alive, the smoke of carbon and the sweat and blood of those who burned it in order to bring our machines alive were too often forgotten by the so-called consumers. But you, from the future, who cannot forget our deeds, please blame our workers less than the rest of us. They sold their sweat for smoke, and we bought their smoke for the sake of our marvelous toys. A different kind of climate change is probably necessary. And hopefully the actions that we take to protect the marvelous human heritage of the world's national parks will be rewarded by future generations' grudging acceptance and understanding, and perhaps even some small, slight admiration. Thank you.
So, like Ambassador Sullivan, who spoke at the beginning of the program, I think of Yellowstone a lot when I think about climate change. In fact, I just returned from Yellowstone last night and got to spend some time talking to the superintendent about climate change and the national park. And I asked him a question I ask of many of the National Park Service people I work with, because they all give very interesting answers. And that's about adaptive management. I know, Gilles, you spoke about it as one of the solutions in your park system. But what does it mean? What does adaptive management really mean? When we think about combating climate change and how climate change is affecting our national parks, what are we trying to manage for? Are we trying to manage for an idealistic period of time, perhaps the pre-Columbian era, perhaps today, and freeze that point in time and make sure that we keep it that way forever? Or are we allowing change to happen and just letting climate change take its course and assuming that there's nothing we can do to stop it? Or are we doing something in the middle where we're seeing what we can do to maintain resilience, balance, introducing human management decisions into a national system, and how far do we go in that? And I'd like to hear both you and then Dr. Macklis, I know you both thought about this a lot, what your thoughts are on that question.
Thanks, Mark, for this key question for the future. I would answer in maybe 3 points. I think first, adaptive management is, as I was mentioning it in my speech, I think it's about looking at a bigger scale than your protected areas. So it's about integrating your ecosystem, the green infrastructure that you are taking care of in your park, in a bigger landscape, and trying to make sense the role, the ecological role of your protected areas in the evolution of that landscape, which is changing because of climate change. If you can really look at these scales of your park and the grander landscape, I think you can start, finding adaptive measures. And I think new satellite images, new technology helps you read as well the state of your ecosystems in terms of water stress, in terms of the state of the soil, in terms of dynamic of species, in terms of the health of the forest, in terms of the health of the ocean, and so on. And at landscape scale, you can start seeing solutions and seeing how you should manage your park to make sure that it actually, again, is conducive to a better ecosystem health. So that's one first answer, I'd say. Look at the grander picture. Go out of the borders of your national park. Then I think within, you still have, as a national park superintendent, you're responsible for the core area of conservation. What do you do in that core area when you have, species that are lost, that are, being weaker and weaker, and so on? You have to decide whether you intervene or not. And I think on that key question, I think that there is no single answer that's valid for all national parks. You will have some parks where the public wants you to conserve an ideal, almost prehistoric landscape at all cost. You have old-growth forests, trees of more than 1,000 years. You are paid to keep them standing because that's what people want, and because, as I said, as with Glaciers or with other places where our hearts really belong, where we build our childhoods and these places, you just want to keep them as they are. And this might be a completely anti-ecological, strategy, but it's an effective strategy. It's an aesthetic, it's an artistic, and that counts very much. And I think the third answer of adaptive management is the young generation. Very recently, we have pledged in France to President Macron that all age class, how do you say that in English? Yes, all kids basically of an age class will have the opportunity to be immersed in a national park or in other protected areas during their childhood for at least a few days, camping and so on. We realize that especially in socially disadvantaged sort of neighborhoods and so on, you have a lot of kids that have less and less access to nature. And when you talk to them about biodiversity and about nature, it's at best it's abstract for them. They have no feelings for it. And at worst, they just don't know anything about it. So we think that bringing all the young generation, to experiencing, wilderness for, at least 1 or 2 nights out camping, observing nature is probably a key answer to finding adapted solutions to climate change. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheila. And Gary, I know you mentioned the work you did at the National Park Service with the group of scientists rethinking park management. What answers did you find to that question?
Interestingly, for an American scientist, the inspiration to me for adaptive management comes from the brilliant German Goethe and his play Faust. And the second part of the play, where Faust faces a general crisis and is about to be lifted up. The devil is confused. Why is God doing that after all that's happened? And God says to the devil in Goethe's version, the nature of man, and he meant all of us, the nature of man is to strive, err, and strive again. And as long as we do that, we are human. So I actually believe the core of adaptive management and the core of scientific support for adaptive management is strive, err, and strive again, and admit error, admit that we don't know enough yet to be masters of the national parks. And that the antidote to hubris is the uncertainty and the faith in strive, err.
Many of the concepts of landscape conservation, looking at lands in a connected way. And sometimes when you do that and you want to protect the national park by looking outside its boundaries, it doesn't make the neighbors very happy, especially if you're limiting their economic opportunities on those lands, whether it's recreation, energy development, what have you. Can you talk about some of your ideas for how you mitigate that, how you bring communities together and get on board with those kinds of management decisions that you need to make to keep the parks healthy in the long run?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the example I would use was a massive effort around protecting the Sagebrush Sea. It spans across 11 states. It's I can't remember the numbers now, 474 million acres or something like that. Could be million square miles, I think it's acres. And you have a lot of people around the table who are working together, and you're trying to find the areas of overlap in their interests. So you've got oil companies that are looking for certainty in their ability to develop resources. You've got ranchers who want to continue to, actually, what matters the most to them is that their children will want to be ranchers and can continue to live the life that they have lived. And when you get out into these rural communities, that is the number one thing that drives people is, I want to be able to pass this on to my family, and I want them to have a future here. When you talk to environmentalists, their concern is, I don't want to lose the species. I've got challenges with invasive species, as Gilles referenced in the national parks in France, the same here. I've got challenges with other forms of disturbance, and so they might want to lock out oil companies, lock out grazing operations, keep it fully protected, and that just means war, basically, between different factions. And the brilliance, I think, of that whole approach, and this was underway when I got there, I'm not taking credit for it, was governors, it was groups like the Audubon Society, others all coming together and sitting around many, many kitchen tables, saying, how can we strike the right balance? Everybody has what they're looking for. So, a deal was struck. I stood on a podium with 2 Republican and 2 Democratic governors talking about the importance of this to their states. Person that really kind of struck the best chord with the audience was a rancher from Nevada, talking about the evolution of his relationship with the federal government from his father to himself and now his daughter, whose new best friend is a scientist from the USGS who's out there monitoring the sage-grouse on his landscapes and has inspired her to become involved in biology as well as stay connected to the lands. In that case, just a quick example. If an oil deposit exists under a critical sage-grouse habitat on private land, we provide an accommodation where an oil company could drill using directional drilling techniques to get to their oil underneath that without having surface disturbance. And so that's an example of a compromise where you're looking to support energy development. I mean, that's not getting into the carbon arguments right now, right? But it's addressing the rights that that individual has to exploit those resources and doing it in a way that's less impactful on the environment. Likewise, I learned from a farmer in Craig, Colorado, or a rancher, that he could create the forbs needed for the sage-grouse chicks by just sort of creating a little wetland by allowing one of his irrigation pipes to dribble on the landscape and create, an artificial wetland that made a big difference, and how he was managing the sagebrush. So these are examples. It takes people, though, coming together around a table seeking common ground. And I will tell you that as the Trump administration went to undermine this incredibly hard work done on the sage-grouse, that one of the Republican governors from a state that has a great amount of great habitat and a great amount of oil and gas and coal development, I saw over the course of last summer, and he said, I am really frustrated that the Trump administration is undoing this because the oil companies are coming to me saying, we thought we had a deal. Why is this being revisited? So, I think that is the future of conservation. It is around understanding our landscapes. It is around taking account of different points of view and finding a way that people can achieve what they're looking for in the context of that collaboration.
And I've been given the time signal. I did have one more question if we could answer very quickly. But I think we talked a lot about oil and gas as an issue. But we talked a lot in the first panel about the need for renewables how much we need to accelerate renewables. As an NGO, of course, we were very appreciative of what the last administration did on renewables. But also as an NGO, of course, we're never completely happy. So we found some renewable energy projects that we opposed because we felt that they were destroying the thing we were trying to save. I'm thinking of massive solar arrays in the California desert and some critical habitat. I think we talked with you about a few of those. We see that with wind. I just returned from Bhutan where I see a very sincere effort to remain carbon negative, but they're building massive, massive hydro, which also has impacts. And so just in the few remaining minutes we have, to talk about how we can accelerate renewable energy in a way that avoids the problems that we created when we developed our first generation of energy. And how can national parks specifically play a role in showing the right path forward on renewables?
I'll just say a few quick words. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Everybody's not going to get everything they're looking for. So how do you compromise in a way that understands the critical values you're trying to protect, but also supports development? Second thing I'll say is the best electron is the one you don't use because of conservation. The best, water conservation is the drop of water you don't use because of your thoughtful management of the water. And public land managers have an opportunity to do that just as citizens. So I'll stop there and let these guys speak.
I 100% support. In addition, it might be good to keep the balance of enthusiasm and prudence somewhat there, because enthusiasm will lead us down paths where we will make unnecessary mistakes. Prudence will warn us about it. One of the most enjoyable things to be a science advisor is the opportunity to be the person who could always say, well, what might go wrong? And that's probably the best question you can ask an environmental leader, a politician, and your family doctor.
Jill, would you like the last word?
I would actually answer that question at a local level, at a territorial level. I think if we look at France as not an example, just as a source of reflection, national parks are less than 5% of the territory. We have another type of park that's called regional parks, which are local initiative. They bring together, because of a very public, quite conducive framework, basically, that manages to bring together public money, local municipal money, private money, forest owners, rangers together, and decide together the future of their territory, including energy solutions, including green infrastructure, and so on. And they agree on that. They usually discuss for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, takes a lot of time, and then what they produce becomes law. It's recognized by the parliament and becomes opposable. I don't know how do you say that in English. Anyway, it becomes as the value of law. And for the development of local green energies and sustainable renewable energies, it's been a key factor. And I think these regional parks cover 25% of France. So the impact is huge. And despite the fact that it's less harder protection, it's not a national park, actually you might question the overall ecological performance if it's not even better than national parks. So sometimes these contract approaches where you bring people together, they sign together, we all agree on a common future, not for the entire nation, just for our territory. And then the state is conducive to these agreements, actually brings money, facilitates the recognition, the legal recognition of that, then you really actually can move forward in greener solutions.
Thank you. I will not stand between you and refreshments. I want to thank Sally, Gary, Gilles. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. And I will thank our hosts and invite you all to the gallery.